Nowadays everybody wants to talk like they've got something to say, but nothing really comes out when they move their lips. It's just a bunch of gibberish, and motherfuckers act like they forgot about Zenith. Hi everyone, and welcome to Shaluso, and yes, today we are talking about Zenith. Now, I originally wanted to release this video last week, but then Zenith released the new Chronomaster Sport, so I kind of had to make a video about that. But in releasing that video and seeing the comments and seeing some of the interactions and opinions people have voiced throughout a lot of the comments on my video as well as on others, it makes this video so much more relevant, and that is talking about how in many ways Zenith is criminally underrated as a brand, and specifically the El Primero and its impact on the watch industry is extremely underrated. So given the fact that I like hip hop, I like watches, I like a good analogy, I thought it'd be fun today to put in context the importance of Zenith by also talking about, in my view, its contemporary within hip hop, which is the legendary producer, Dr. Dre. Now, Dr. Dre has been responsible for building so many careers through his production, in addition to releasing his own solo albums, but often his influence has been much more on the production side and in terms of artist development and really helping artists realize their true potential more than his own albums, despite the fact that they're amazing. In addition to that, he is also one of the few rappers in the hip-hop industry who gets kind of a pass for not writing his own lyrics because of the impact he's had on the industry as a whole, and because he does tend to recruit the very best lyricists to write his verses, so it also kind of you get a pass for that. And I see a lot of parallels in that and in the El Primero. The El Primero is an amazing movement on its own. It's been the behind the scenes power for a lot of great watches, given a lot of brands their leg up into the chronograph industry, essentially. But at the same time, it never really gets the full credit it deserves. And looking at some of the backlash that the new Chronomaster Sport got, I think it's important to understand the context of just how important the El Primero has been to watches in general, as well as how important it's been to the Daytona specifically. So now with the scene set, I'm going to be talking about different parallels between hip-hop and watches in the context of the Zenith El Primero. And starting with what the El Primero is most famous for, arguably more famous than actually being the first automatic integrated chronograph, and that is its contribution to the Rolex Daytona. So for this example, I'm going to equate the Rolex Daytona to Eminem. Now both of these are highly charged and highly polarizing rapper and watch respectively, so I want to start out with some clear-cut facts that simply are indisputable. In the case of Eminem, he is the world's best-selling hip-hop artist. He's sold over 220 million records. He's featured in several people's top 10s. He's undisputably an amazing lyricist. Where he ranks on your top 10 is entirely subjective, of course, but it's undeniable his talent. And also, he has very openly, many times, said that without Dr. Dre, he wouldn't be where he was today. Moving on to the Rolex Daytona is probably one of the most in-demand watches. It's one of the most successful chronographs, one of the most successful comebacks for a chronograph, considering that pre-1988, the Rolex Daytona was a dog for Rolex. They had trouble moving them out of the door. In addition to that, a lot of the Daytona's success is entirely owed to itself. It has gotten there on its own 2 feet. The introduction of the 4130 in the year 2000 was a huge milestone for what defines a modern chronograph, and chronograph movements like the B01 from Breitling, the 9300 and 9900 series from Omega, the Heuer 02, all of these followed a very similar blueprint to what the 4130 laid out in the year 2000. So the merits of the Daytona are there, and its success is undisputable. However, while in the case of hip-hop, Eminem is always there openly acknowledging and paying tribute to Dr. Dre for helping him forge his amazingly successful career, that's not so much the case in the watch world. In the worst case, people don't even know the relationship between the Daytona and Zenith, and in most cases, people say, well, it was powered by the Zenith pre-2000s, and then they had their own movement and call it a day. But it's much, much more than that. The Daytona prior to 1988 was powered by a Valjoux 72, and it was one of the worst performing Rolex watches out there. It was being outsold by the Day-Date, being outsold by Datejust, Submariners. Essentially the complete opposite of what today's market is like. It wasn't until they were able to put an automatic chronograph movement, in that case based on the same El Primero that we can still get today, that the Rolex Daytona really took off, that the waitlist started, the premium started, the desirability started. And that was because it was finally able to compete not just on the same level as other automatic chronographs, but actually a little bit better because of the fact that the El Primero was so advanced. Gotta remember, released in 1969, but to this day still used in the same iteration, column wheel chronograph, 36,000 VPH beat rate, fully integrated. These were things that weren't commonplace, definitely not in the 60s when it was brand new. They weren't even commonplace in the late 80s when it was powering the Daytona. And while yes, people talk about the fact that Rolex completely reworked the El Primero, they reduced the beat rate, they took away the date, they changed a lot of the parts over to make it more simple, they still needed that foundation. Making a chronograph movement is expensive. It's difficult to engineer. It's one of the reasons why new chronograph movements don't come out every few years. It's a very difficult thing to do, so Rolex needed that head start, especially if they were going to be doing this effort for a watch that didn't sell well. If this didn't work out for them, it would have been a huge waste of money for them to completely develop their own chronograph. So they needed something that could still form a positive base, and that's what the El Primero was for the Daytona. Bringing this back to my analogy of hip-hop, the 16520 Daytona was like the Slim Shady LP and the Marshall Mathers LP. Both of them, while still showcasing tons of Eminem's talent, they wouldn't have been anywhere near as successful were it not for Dr. Dre's production, supervision of the entire album as an executive producer, and the backing and marketing from his label Aftermath and their collaboration with Interscope Records. And then of course Eminem has forged his own career on his own. Something like the Eminem Show, for example, he produced nearly all of the tracks on it, but Dr. Dre was still present. In the same way that while the Daytona did create its own in-house movement in the year 2000, in that case the 16520 was still using the same design that the predecessor had. And that design wouldn't have been so successful if it didn't have the El Primero behind the scenes powering it. If it was just an El Abajou 72, it would have been just a manual chronograph, which wasn't that popular back then. If it was a 7750, it would have probably been too thick. One of the USPs of the Daytona is that it's thin for a chronograph despite still having 100 meters water resistance. So in the same way that Eminem forged his own career but still was very much where he is today because of the influence of Dr. Dre, the Daytona has undisputably become an extremely successful watch, but it wouldn't have gotten there without the presence of the El Primero to be there when it needed it most, to give it that kick. And for that reason alone, the El Primero deserves a lot of credit. But the El Primero story doesn't stop with just the Daytona. In the same way that Dr. Dre has developed tons of other artists and been influential on their careers. So the next example I'm going to give is Busta Rhymes, specifically his album, The Big Bang. Now this was an interesting album because Busta Rhymes had his own career and had been successful on his own for quite a long time. However, by the time 2006 came around, he hadn't released an album since I think like 2002, 2003. So he needed something to give that extra energy, and as an artist that had a lot of energy to begin with, it needed to be a big effort. In the same way, Panerai had been riding high for most of the 90s thanks to their association with Sylvester Stallone, then Bruce Willis, Arnold Schwarzenegger. They were getting a lot of positive buzz. But at that point, apart from the Mare Nostrum, they hadn't made a chronograph. The Luminor, which was one of their highlight models, had never had a chronograph before, and they weren't making in-house movements at that time either. So what better way to jump into the chronograph game in the same way that Rolex did when they were jumping into the automatic chronograph game? Use the El Primero. And that's exactly what happened with 4 key references launched from 2000 up until 2003. The PAM 52, the PAM 72, the PAM 74, and the PAM 108. Now 2 of those were limited editions. Definitely my favorite is the PAM 52, which was limited to only 500 pieces, and which is in the steel titanium, very similar to that Luminor GMT that I featured about a year ago on the channel. I think that is a great showcase of what Panerai can be when they try to be a little bit out of their comfort zone. But coming back to the El Primero powered ones, these only lasted a few years, but what they did is they helped Panerai establish itself with credibility when it comes to making chronographs. Then obviously they passed on to using 7750 based chronographs. Now they have their own in-house ones, they have regatta timers, they have a full-fledged chronograph line. But it all started with the El Primero. The El Primero gave them that credibility. Much in the same way that for Busta Rhymes, he needed that boost to his career at that crucial time. And while The Big Bang wasn't his best-selling album overall, in fact it was the beginning of the decline when it comes to his sales numbers, it was also his first #1 opening, and also it featured a lot of sonically different tracks to what you would normally hear from Busta Rhymes. So it showed a different side. It was him able to experiment with something else while still being successful enough to then continue on with his career. After this, we got more what you call singles Busta Rhymes. Things started on the Big Bang with Touch It, then Arab Money, then his feature on All I Do Is Win, his feature on Look At Me Now with Chris Brown. So again, it allowed him to further evolve as an artist and break past what he had already established, in the same way that Panerai was able to break through what they had already established to explore other complications in this case, and to continue on as a brand today, much in the same way that Busta Rhymes is still an artist today. It's given them the ability to maintain their relevance. Last but not least, the last example I'm going to use is 50 Cent, specifically with the song New Day. Released in 2012, this was his first Billboard 100 hit since 2009's Baby by Me. Now, this wasn't his biggest success by far, however, it was a way for him to maintain relevance again and to link up with an old friend, in this case Dr. Dre. And this is very similar to what happened with 2014's Spirit of Big Bang. Obviously, by this point, both Zenith and Hublot were part of LVMH, so they were, again, in the same way, label mates, so to say. And while the Spirit of Big Bang definitely doesn't compare to the success that Hublot had with the regular Big Bang when it first came out, it still allowed Hublot to further develop, to stay relevant, introduce a new model, and again, have that extra credibility. What horologically is credibility in the music world, it's just having that sound, having that polish that a Dr. Dre instrumental brings to a project. And it still exists today in the same way that 50 Cent has still managed to stay relevant while branching into television, branching into other projects. It gave him a little bit of a boost at a time where it had been a while since he released any music and he hadn't even charted since 2009. Gotta remember, this is an artist who was used to charting with every single he put out. Pretty much any project he was on, he would get a top 100. So again, it showcases the way that Dr. Dre has not only been able to create careers, but also the way he's been able to rejuvenate them. And the El Primero is still doing that over 50 years after its initial release. And that's just an amazing quality that really no other movement is able to say about itself. And now, in the same way that Dr. Dre released Compton a few years ago after he was inspired by the Straight Outta Compton biopic about his participation in the forming of NWA, we have the Chronomaster Sport, which is again showcasing evolution, showcasing growth, building on both what Zenith had done before as well as the contributions it's made to the watch industry. So hopefully that gives a little bit of context as to exactly how important the El Primero is and why you should consider it as important and why you should respect it. But in any case, let me know in the comments below, what do you think of the Zenith El Primero? Do you think that it's worthy of the reverence and respect that I'm saying it should get and that others say it should get as well? Or do you think it's just another movement and at the end of the day they need to move on from their legacy? I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments below. And also I'd like to know your thoughts on what other parallels you see between hip-hop and the watch industry or music and the watch industry in general. It's always interesting seeing when things sort of intersect with our other passions, so I'd love to know your thoughts on what sort of comparisons you see between the watch industry and other passions and hobbies that you have. In any case, if you like this video, make sure you like it and share it. If you want to see more pictures of the watches I've featured throughout this, as well as several others, then make sure you follow me on Instagram at Shaluso. And of course, if you want to keep seeing new watch videos, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell as well so you know when the next video comes out. In any case, thanks for watching this video and we'll catch you on the next one.